This is Duke University.
Good evening. I'm David Levy. I'm Dean of the Duke Law School. Welcome to the Law School. We have many distinguished people here with us, including our president, Richard Broadhead, and Mrs. Broadhead. Welcome to the Law School. We had an event similar to this in December of 2008, and it was a time when we were all a good deal more nervous, I think, although perhaps some of us are still fairly nervous. And I'm going to introduce our panel, but I know you were thinking, I don't think I see Gao Xiqing up there. Oh. and you don't. And the reason you don't is that he is in the air between New York and RDU. Apparently, there was a basketball game at Duke yesterday, and I went to the game. And there was so much air traffic in conjunction with that game that they are still trying to sort out the system. That's only partly in jest. And then Mr. James is also with Gao Xiqing, and so they will arrive together. Nonetheless, I will introduce them so that when they come, they can just take their seats and we can carry on seamlessly. So our moderator will be my esteemed colleague, Jim Cox, who's known to so many here. He is one of the leading authorities on securities law. He's the Brainerd Currie professor at Duke Law School. He's a nationally known scholar and commenter. I'm sure many of you have read of him in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and he's a marvelous teacher and a wonderful person here on campus. And seated next to him is John Canning, Jr., who is a 1969 graduate of the Duke Law School. He's the co-founder of Madison Dearborn Partners, which he co-founded in 1992. When he left the law school, he actually was not looking for a legal job, but nonetheless he found one with First Chicago Corporation, which was, I think, the first national bank in Chicago. He currently serves on the board of directors of the Milwaukee Brewers Baseball Club, among other many civic institutions. He's the former director and chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. His AB is from Denison University. Welcome, John. Our Career Center is named after John. Seated next to John is David Rubenstein, a trustee of this university and a 1970 graduate of Trinity here at Duke. He is the co-founder and managing director of the Carlyle Group, which he founded in 1987, a private equity firm. Early in his career, he practiced law in New York with Paul Weiss. He later practiced law in Washington, D.C. with Shaw Pittman. From 1975 to 1976, he served as chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, to its subcommittee on constitutional amendments. And then from 1977 to 81, he was deputy assistant to the President Carter, for domestic policy. He's a regent of the Smithsonian Institution, and as I say, he is a trustee at Duke, but also a trustee at the University of Chicago, from whence he got his law degree. Some terrible error in judgment, perhaps on his part, or perhaps on our part. I don't know which. And seated next to him will be, and I can't read it, but I will say it is Tony James, but perhaps it is Gao, but I'll get to Gao in a moment. And Tony James is the president and chief operating officer of Blackstone. Prior to joining Blackstone, Mr. James was chair of global investment banking and private equity at Credit Suisse, First Boston. He is a director of Costco and Swift River Investments, and he served on a number of other corporate and civic boards. And then finally, our graduate, Gao Xiqing, is a 1986 graduate of this law school. He is vice chair, president, and chief investment officer of the China Investment Corporation. Previously, he served as vice chair of the National Council for the Social Security Fund of China from 2003 to 2007, following his position as vice chair of the China Securities Regulatory Commission. He was a Richard Nixon Scholar at Duke Law School. He received his bachelor's degree and a master's of law from Beijing University's International Business and Economics University. He teaches from time to time here at the law school, which is marvelous, and also at Tsinghua University. He's been a trustee of Duke University since 2008. So I will turn it over now to Professor Cox.
Well, we did one of these programs in December of 2008, and a few months before that, the big celebrative event was dedicating the new wing of the building. And I remember sharing dinner with Susan Stolnicker, one of our trustees here, and she was asking me what I thought was remarkable about the crisis at that point. We were just at the front end of it. And there were several remarkable things, but the one that came to my mind was that how worldwide it was and how quick. You may remember the reply was that in a very short period of time, less than 2 weeks, we found governments around the world ponying up something like $2.5 trillion into their banking systems right away, overnight. We learned out more about the crisis moving forward. The estimates are that the amount of commercial floor space has to be shrunk by 20 to 25% around the United States. We overbuilt that. That home ownership, which historically has been about 62% for families, has gotten up to close 70%, and so beyond the level that was sustainable for any sort of a well-developed economy. Leveraging. I mean, we thought leverage was bad when we threw up our hand when we heard that Lehman Brothers had a leverage of 33, 34 to 1. That's before we knew about the repos 405, which really made the numbers 50 to 60 to 1 until you got to the quarter and they cleaned things up. So we've gone through a period. I think most of us feel that we're still going through that. And so we thought it was a good time to come back and figure out more or less what lessons have learned, where are we, and more importantly, eventually, will the panel turn about how this has impacted your business. But before we get to that, want to learn a little bit about acquisitions, right? And so David's going to tell us something about the Magna Carta, I believe.
Can you hear me without a microphone? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm from Washington, D.C., and there we specialize in filibusters. And so I'm going to filibuster for a few minutes so we buy some time. That's what I'm doing. So I've been a designated filibuster, and I just want to talk about two things I bought and one thing to set the tone for later on. One of my current jobs is to be the chairman of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. Some of you may have attended that. It was set up and opened in 1971 in Washington as a living memorial to President Kennedy, the only living memorial to the President of the United States. And this weekend we celebrate our Kennedy Center Honors Program. Some of you may have seen this on television. I hope you'll watch it this year. It's December 28th. Oprah Winfrey and Paul McCartney, among others, will be honored. And the point of this, though, is that in researching some of the things about this, I realized that just in a few weeks, we'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of President Kennedy's inauguration. 50 years. Now, how many people were alive when he was inaugurated? Wow, okay. That's more than I thought. Well, some of you may remember his famous speech. It was a brilliant speech written really by a man I worked for named Ted Sorensen, who unfortunately died just about 2 weeks ago, and we were going to have him come to the Kennedy Center and read from that famous speech. We will have a big event on January 20th, 2011, where the current President of the United States and 150 members of the Kennedy family and Caroline Kennedy will be there. And in doing some research for this, I realized that the debt situation in the United States then was so much different than now. In 1960, when President Kennedy was elected, by the way, we were then 48% of the GDP of the entire world. The United States was 48% of the world's GDP. Today, we are 22%. The deficit in the United States in 1960, can anybody guess what it was? Zero. Close, $1 billion. The deficit today is $13.5 trillion, not counting $5.5 trillion of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac debt, and not counting $60 trillion of unfunded pension liabilities. But leaving that aside, the total debt of the United States then was, anybody know? Total debt, not deficit, $320 billion. That was it. So it was a completely different situation. Anybody know what 1960 was the most popular TV show?
I Love Lucy.
Oh, any guesses? They were all Westerns. Gunsmoke, Have Gun Will Travel, and Wagon Train. Anybody know what the most popular movie was in 1960? Psycho. Okay? You're too young to remember this. So, I wanted to talk to you about something not relating to President Kennedy. We're going to talk about the debt situation in a few minutes when Dr. Gow and Tony James come, but I want to just relate something to you as prospective as law school students or prospective lawyers. How many people here are students in the law school? How many are lawyers? Okay. I want to tell you about something that happened to me that changed my life, and it relates to the law. And here's what it is, and something like this may happen to you as well. In life, you never can predict certain things. If you plan for something too much, it may not happen. And sometimes not planning for something actually makes something good happen, or sometimes it happens by serendipity. I was flying back from London, heading to New York, and I'm reading my mail, and I saw that that night in New York, a showing of the Magna Carta was going to occur. The Magna Carta, as law school students would know, is among the most famous, probably the most famous document in Western history. It was a document that originally was signed by King John in 1215, though he abrogated it within 2 weeks because he was told he'd be excommunicated. But subsequently, his son and his grandson signed other Magna Cartas. And now, as a result of there are 17 Magna Cartas left in the world. There were, each time there was a Magna Carta signed in 1215, 1224, 1225, and 1297. About 35 copies of these were actually made, handwritten, on parchment. Parchment is like animal skin, and over many, many years, 700 years, mice eat it or rats eat it, or people file it away and they lose it. And how many of you have filed something away you can't find it 5 years later? Well, 700 years later, it's very difficult to find these things. And so, as a result, there are only 17 left. 15 are in British institutions, libraries or the government. One is in the Australian Parliament. And then one family had it in its possession for 500 years. And they became land poor. They offered it for sale, and Ross Perot bought it. Ross Perot is a disputatious person, and he got into some fights with people over it after he bought it. He put it on display in the National Archives, but he kind of had some disagreements with them from time to time. He took it off display, put it back on. Eventually, he got tired of it. He put it up for sale. And this sale that Sotheby's was holding was a sale where they said it could go to anybody. And I thought, well, as I was reading about it, this is a document which was really the inspiration for Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration of Independence. It was the inspiration for James Madison and others in writing the Bill of Rights. It was the inspiration for many of the state constitutions in our country. And it really, while not written here, it would be a good thing to keep it in our country. So I decided to go look at this document. I got there that night, 5 minutes before it was, the showing was over, and the curator said that it was expected that it would go to somebody from, the Middle East or somebody from the Far East, and would leave our country. And the only copy that would ever be in our country's hands. So I decided that night I was going to buy it. Now, I didn't want to tell my wife because people would think, you're crazy. Tell your wife I'm going to go buy the Magna Carta tomorrow. So it didn't seem like. And I knew if I told my children that, they'd say, well, how much less money does this mean for us? So I didn't tell anybody. The auction was the next night. Now, I'd never been to Sotheby's because I never collected art and so forth. So I just decided I was going to come back the next day. I flew back to Washington that night, came back the next day. I barely got there in time. I got there about 5 of 7. The auction's at 7 o'clock. And I run in, and the curator's there. I told her I was going to come, and she said, well, go into this little room over here and get ready for the auction. I said, well, no, I want to go down and bid, like I see on TV, you bid, and she said, that's on TV. We're not going to do that. You go over in this little room. So I didn't want to argue. I'd miss the auction. So I get in the little room. They lock the door, pick up a telephone. They start bidding. And they start bidding, and I get in the swing of things, and all of a sudden, I put a bid in. The guy says, sold. Uh-oh, I just bought the Magna Carta. So the head of Sotheby's comes in and says, congratulations, you just bought the Magna Carta. Who are you? You've never been here before. You do have the money, right? I said, yes, I have the money. He says, okay, well, you can slip out the side door, and nobody will ever know who owns it, because we don't really care as long as you pay. Or you can go out and tell people what you've done. There's 100 reporters there. So I said, no, I wanted to go out and tell people that I was going to make it as a permanent gift to the National Archives as to kind of repay my debt to the country. And I did that. And it's now in the National Archives. And any of you can go see it. It'll be there forever. But after I did that, I went to a dinner party that night and to the home of the head of Citicorp, and I said, sorry, I'm late. I just bought the Magna Carta. And he said, oh, sure. And then the next day, when it was in the front page of the New York Times, he called me to apologize. He said, I thought you were making a joke. I didn't realize it was true. The next couple of days, though, I get calls from people all over the world saying, well, if you want to buy a Magna Carta, I have one. And so I get all these things. I call up Sotheby's. I thought I had the only one in private hands. And so it turns out that there are a lot of fakes and so forth. So I have a standard letter now. I say to people, thank you for offering me your Magna Carta, but I don't want to corner the market on it, so I'm not going to buy anymore. But I have bought, and I'll mention one other document I did buy. I bought a rare copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln, as you may all know, signed it in January 1 of 1863. And it was very complicated. Most of his cabinet was not in favor of it. He wrote it out himself, it's not a flowing, beautiful document like the Gettysburg Address. It's a very legalistic document. He did it because he was afraid it would be overturned by the Supreme Court if he gave reasons and so forth. So it's a very legalistic document. And the original of that is in the National Archives right now. But he signed a couple other copies as souvenirs. And they were to be sold for the equivalent of the Red Cross to get money for Civil War veterans and pensions and so forth. And they were sold for $10 apiece. Well, very few of them actually sold. And there are about 7 of them left. And I bought one of them. And another one that's going for sale next Friday is one that's owned by Robert Kennedy. There are about 7 of these, and Robert Kennedy owned one, and his is going for sale as well next week. So I bought it, and I said, what I want to do with it is give it to the White House because I think it belongs in the Lincoln bedroom. Lincoln actually signed it in what was then Lincoln's office. In those days, the cabinet was 7 people, the White House staff was 2 people. Lincoln met in what is now called the Lincoln bedroom, Lincoln office. And I offered it to the White House. I said, I'll give it to you, put it there. And they came back and said, well, nobody will see it in the Lincoln bedroom. This isn't the Clinton administration. Nobody uses the Lincoln bedroom. So we want to put it in the Oval Office. And so, okay, so you'll come in, we'll have a ceremony, and the president will thank you and so forth. Then they said, well, we have a better idea. We'll do it on Martin Luther King's birthday. And on Martin Luther King's birthday, we'll have civil rights leaders from all over the country coming in. We'll surprise them by walking in from the cabinet room into the Oval Office and say, now, permanently here is a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation, probably the most significant document any president actually signed on his own to actually do something on his own. And I said, okay, and you bring your family, and okay, everything will be fine. They called me 2 days before and said, the president is really excited about this, but you can't come. Because you're in the private equity world, and it won't look good if the president takes a gift from private equity. So we have to rearrange it. So anyway, they did have the ceremony. It's said to be from the Smithsonian, but it's my document that I've given on permanent loan to the White House, and it's in the Oval Office, and if you get there, you'll see it. Actually, the president, to be fair, did later invite my family in with no cameras to thank us. But anyway, but as a lawyer, not a good lawyer, as a lawyer, I do like buying some historical documents and putting them in places where I think people can see them, and I've done that twice. So that is the filibuster a bit, and I'd like to now turn it over to John to talk a little bit about
Well, John, I'm going to depart from the prepared script and just ask, would you buy the Magna Carta from this man?
I would buy it from him, but I don't have as much money as he does, so I can't possibly afford it.
So tell us a little bit about lessons you've learned or hope to learn from the crisis. We're 2 years into it.
All right. First of all, I noticed there were a lot of Duke students here by the show of hands, and you heard I did graduate. I noticed there were a lot of lawyers here, so they must have gone to law school. Now, how many finished in the bottom 10th of their class? Okay, we don't have a whole lot in common. But I can prove it. So just to put it in a little context, I was here, if you recall, in December '08, and no one was feeling too happy then. In '06 and '07, more private equity deals were done in the whole history of private equity. There were approximately, just in the U.S. alone, over $650 billion worth of private equity deals were done. There were 17 buyouts of more than $10 billion. Before that time, the only buyout that had ever been done of that size was RJR, and that didn't go very well. And since that time, there's only been one of that size. So there was a clear bubble in activity. And during the period of '06, '07, and even into '08, because it kind of had an overhang, over $1 trillion poured into just buyout funds in the United States alone. So you had a spectacular amount of money pouring into the industry. You had the obvious result of people having to deploy that money. And then you had credit markets that were extremely accommodating, much like we have now, so that banks who were able to make commitments on loans and quickly syndicate the loans, to get them off their balance sheet, were not really overly concerned about terms, covenants. They weren't concerned really about even getting interest paid. They had something called interest rate toggle, which allowed you to pay interest in further notes. They weren't concerned about the length of maturities. So the private equity industry, because they were going to quickly syndicate this to bond funds and other investors that were really just hungry for yield, because the yields on other alternative instruments were so low. So you had this explosion of transactions, and primarily good companies. Most of the private equity firms bought good companies. This was not a question of buying bad companies. And when the syndication market closed down literally in 1 week in July of '07, primarily because of problems that were in the subprime area that came to light when people focused on the fact that they weren't buying the tranches of securities that had the safety that the credit rating agencies awarded them. The bank syndication market closed down, and banks had almost $400 billion in either forward commitments or actual paper that they had planned to syndicate, and liquidity dried up literally in a week. And that began a long, serious, not only liquidity crisis, but ultimately what turned into one of the severest recessions ever imagined. So all of us got hit by it, actually, if those 17 buyouts I referred to at one time, at least all of them, except one, probably the deal Alcatel. Was that your deal?
Unfortunately,
That
it
was
was stolen
TPG.
the last minute by Goldman and TPG.
Yeah, that was the only one that actually got out whole. Every other deal at one time was written down on the books of the private equity holders. Bonds were trading in the 16, 17 cents on the dollar. And at least half were for sure going to go bankrupt. As we fast forward, none of them are going to go bankrupt. Many of them are still carried below par, but none of them are going to go bankrupt because of something I'll describe in a second. So, if you remember, I was a little down in the mouth when I was here last time. I got downer in the mouth as I got into the first couple of months in '09, as I saw how severe things were. And I'd say that there's several lessons that Madison Dearborn partners learned. The first was everybody does significant downside tests on its companies. Our severest downside cases were not severe enough. And even though we had spectacular terms on all our credit, we had many cases, no amortization till maturity, long-term maturity dates, very few covenants. They called it euphemistically covenant light, many things with the interest rate toggle where you didn't have to pay interest in cash. Nevertheless, the strain of the significant drop in business was way worse than our worst case, and there was no liquidity. You couldn't even get bankers to return your call, so when you wanted to restructure your revolver or even draw on your revolver, you didn't know if you were able to. So the lesson, for instance, I'll just give you one anecdote. We bought Naveen Securities. The S&P was trading at 1560 in October of 2007 when we bought it. We never ran a case that said that in 15 months the S&P would be at 666, 57% drop. So we have since corrected that and stress test to the disaster scenario all of our portfolio companies. The second thing we learned was leverage. The ability to access leverage on spectacular terms at very low cost creates an illusion in the private equity company that takes on the leverage to acquire somebody in a buyout, because it gives you the illusion that you're getting the equivalent of an equity risk security at a very low rate, at very low debt rates. But what it really does is it's really turned out in history to be a transfer of wealth to the seller of the company. And it really just, the benefits of the leverage really inure to the benefits of the seller and allow you to convince yourself that you can pay a higher price because you're paying very low, the equity-like debt you got is a very low cost. So we now have a rule that we will not take more than 5 times leverage on any transaction, and it makes us as prices now have started to come back up and leverage is starting to go back up, we've become very less competitive on buyouts. We can't be as competitive on buyouts that are public auctions because there'll always be a private equity firm that will break the price discipline. There's also a competitive aspect to leverage now that's very dangerous. There's a big overhang of private equity because of all those commitments, that $1 trillion that was committed over 3 years. That doesn't get spent right away. There's probably, you may have a better figure than I do, but we estimate about $450 billion of unspent private equity in the United States. There's going to be a big shakeout in the private equity industry. My guess is 30 to 40% of private equity firms that exist today won't exist when their fund expires. But the worst competitor to face is a private equity firm that has unspent money that is starting to realize it may not be able to raise another fund, and it has 2 or 3 years left to spend that money. So that the bidding for buyouts can be extremely price insensitive. So we've backed away from buyouts. We have another part of our business that a lot of the big private equity firms don't do. 60% of what we've done in number of deals and 40% of what we've done in dollars has been what we call structured equity, but it's growth capital to companies that won't need the capital to grow, either by acquisition or organic growth. Companies that can't access public markets or other sources of capital. So we have switched our business to primarily that now. These are minority investments. There's a little more risk with minority investments, and they don't use leverage as much. And so our business mix is really shifted to that, and we're not as active now in the buyout area. We have done 2 buyouts where we took only 5 times leverage. The biggest and final, I'd say, lesson learned was when we had a $6 billion fund, and we committed $5 billion of it in 2 years. And while we took, it was well spread over industries. The concentration of time was a significant risk, and our investors were really not happy that we took that kind of risk where we concentrated at time and made that band of investments all prone to a downturn that none of us saw coming. So that we now have a rule that we cannot invest more than 1/5 of our fund in any one year, and it forces a lot of things, but it also forces the diversification for the time risk of concentration during a time when you'd have a lot of leverage and get hit by a cycle. So those are some of the things.
I'd like to comment on 2 of those points. I think those are good points. And when you're trying to relive history, you never know for sure what history would have been like had you done something differently. Had we borrowed less money, would we not have had a recession? This point was brought home to me, again, using John Kennedy story. Mikhail Gorbachev was at the Kennedy School not long ago, and he was speaking in front of students, and he was asked, well, Mr. Gorbachev, how would the world have been different if John Kennedy had not been assassinated in 1963, but Nikita Khrushchev had been assassinated? And Mikhail Gorbachev, not missing a beat, said, well, obviously it's very difficult to predict how history would have changed. I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you one thing. I can tell you for sure that Aristotle Onassis would not have married Mrs. Khrushchev. Now,
that proves my point.
right, exactly. To put it, the 2 points that you were making, I'd like to put it in my context at least. Before the Great Depression, the United States GDP, we had 250% of our GDP was in debt, government debt and consumer debt, right before the Great Depression, 1929. Before this Great Recession, we were 300% of our GDP in debt. So we were actually worse than the situation before the Great Depression. And that debt was what led to the problem, and I'll get into that in one moment. But put the recession in context. When we were going to probably have a recession even if we didn't have the subprime problem, because we have recessions in this country after World War II every 7 years, and they last on average 9 months. The average recession, the stock market goes down 22%, industrial production goes down about 7%, unemployment goes up 2 points, from its 4.5, it'll go up to let's say 6.5. In this recession, the recession went on not for 9 months, it went on for 23 months. The unemployment rate went from 4.5, not to 6.5, but to 10.2, but really that's a deceptive number because we measure unemployment in this country by people who look for jobs in the last 4 weeks. The real unemployment rate today is not 9.6 as it's said to be, but it's about 16.5. So the unemployment rate was much bigger in a normal recession. And the stock market, peak to trough, went down 58%. So it was an enormous recession. We technically have recovered from it because we've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, but the definition of recession is dated, and we really shouldn't say we're out of a recession. We have enormous economic problems today. Unemployment is still high. We have the deficit that's 41% of our budget, and again, the $13.5 trillion of debt. It'll take us a number of years to get out of this. We'd have to grow at about 6% a year to get out of this problem and get back to the 8.5 million jobs we lost in the recession. In the recession, we lost 8.5 million jobs. About 8 million of those people will never get those jobs back from the same employer. 3/4 of the people who lost their jobs were men, and now we have, for the first time in our country's history, more women in the workforce than men. We've never had that before in our country's history, and that will produce some social and other issues, no doubt. But the problem is that we went into this recession unprepared for it, and we didn't really have a mechanism to deal with the debt problems, and we had to struggle when we muddled our way through it. The problem was much deeper than anybody recognized, and even today, the debt we have in our country isn't much different than it was right before we went into it. We've taken a lot of debt off the personal balance sheets of people who have paid down their credit card bills and maybe not and paid down their mortgages or gotten rid of their mortgages, but the government has borrowed so much more money that we now have about still 300% of GDP in debt. And so if we were anything other than the United States, the IMF would be coming in and trying to bail us out. Because we're a little bit too big for the IMF, we have to deal with our problems differently. And we still have a gigantic debt problem, and the deficit commission that is operating in Washington is pretty much dead on arrival because people don't want to take the serious medicine that's necessary. You can get your way out of this debt problem one of 5 ways. You can inflate your way out of it, and it didn't work in the Weimar Republic. Probably it's not going to work here. Secondly, you can default, and probably the United States can't really default. Third, you can go to the IMF for a bailout, but it's a little embarrassing for the United States to do that, and probably the IMF doesn't have enough money. So there are only 2 other ways left. You have to cut spending, and you have to increase taxes. There's no other way to get out of this debt problem. And unless we do that in a serious way in the next couple of years, we are going to be back in this problem over and over again, and everyone in this room is going to have a lifestyle that's much less than you expected, and your children and grandchildren have a much lesser lifestyle than you have enjoyed because we just have too much debt. Now, in the private equity world, to get to that, the private equity world is not immune from the problems that hit the debt markets and hit the economy. There's a wonderful phrase in the hedge fund world called absolute return. The implication is markets go up, markets go down, we get you an absolute return. We have never said that we're that in private equity. Markets go down, we go down, maybe not as much, but we go down. Markets go up, we go up, probably more. The essence of private equity is that we get a higher rate of return than you can get in the public markets. If you are investing in a top quartile private equity firm, you will probably get a return that is 3 to 7 times as great as you might have gotten if you put your money in a public market index. That's why people put money in private equity. The returns are much better, generally, particularly if you're fortunate enough to be in a top quartile return. Top quartile fund. In this particular time, though, because the recession was so great, as John mentioned, companies were thought to be in deep trouble. There were 4 things predicted about private equity. Number 1, general partners would go out of business. 2, limited partners would default on their capital calls. 3, the government would come in and say, no more of this, you guys are out of business. And 4, the major buyouts in the United States would go bankrupt, and ones in Europe would as well, because they were all over levered. People had paid too much. What actually happened in the end was a little bit different than what people predicted, as John said. No major firm in the United States or Europe is actually going out of business yet. Some may not survive to have another fund, but they haven't actually gone out of business or imploded. Secondly, no major limited partner actually defaulted of any consequence. The reason is, although they didn't have a lot of money, they were afraid not to honor their capital calls because most of the money was coming from pension funds. Pension funds were deathly afraid that they didn't honor their capital calls, that their pensioners would say, well, wait a second, you didn't honor your capital call to Carlyle, maybe you don't have the money to honor the capital call to me, the pensioner, when you have to pay my pension. So they were afraid of doing that. So they didn't dishonor their capital calls. Third, the government basically did a study, and it ultimately came out through the Dodd-Frank's bill, which says that the cause of systemic risk, more or less, was the major banks and the investment banks. It was not the private equity firms. And so the government has not put any real constraints on private equity firms. We have to register with the SEC, but the government basically gave us a pass and said we're not to blame. And fourth, of the 25 largest buyout deals done at the height of the bubble, I think none of them has actually gone bankrupt. Now, some should have, as John said, but because of very forgiving debt terms, they were not. And now some of these deals are going to come back and be very good. So the private equity world is on its rebound, and the private equity world is likely to survive and do quite well for two major reasons. The basic business model of private equity works. If you give a CEO and a management team a stake in the company, you let them work in a private setting generally, you give them 4 to 6 years, they're generally going to make the company more efficient than it was before, and generally the returns will be pretty good. And so that is a major reason why the business model works. Basically, by making managers owners, it does tend to help, and the private equity firms can add some value, not as much as they say, but some value. The second thing is there's an enormous need for the returns that private equity can get. The biggest private equity investors in the world right now, or in the United States, are public pension funds, the state pension funds. And the reason they have to go into private equity is this. The state legislators will say, we're going to give you, the state workers, a certain pension guarantee of X dollars. But we're only going to tax you up to, let's say, 70% of that. So you're going to be 30% underfunded. And so you have to have the pension fund manager figure out how to make up this gap so you're a fully funded pension fund. So what does the pension fund manager do? He says, how can I get a higher rate of return? Well, I can go into hedge funds or private equity. I'll go into private equity because they're going to get me a better return. So all this state pension money has come into private equity trying to get these higher rates of return. And that gap is going to continue. In fact, it's going to get worse because we're continuing to give very large pension guarantees to pension workers or pensioners, and we're not actually giving enough money to the pension funds to pay those benefits. So the pension fund managers have to look for higher and higher yield, and that problem is going to exacerbate for quite some time. So generally, I think the private equity industry has come back. It's going to probably get better returns than people predicted a few years ago, not as good as they predicted or they were many years ago, but still for people who want a career in private equity, rather than the law, it's still probably going to pay a little bit better than the law.
Well, on that last point about it not as good as many years ago, is that a result that the transaction today is not nearly as highly leveraged as in the past? I mean, interest rates are low, it's hard to borrow the money. Are you putting in more of your own money these days? Or?
When buyout world was first started, the average equity component was 5%. So you're borrowing 95%. If the U.S. economy is growing at 6% and you're buying companies at 3 and 4 times cash flow, as sellers were selling it sometimes, you can make a lot of money. You can go to the beach and make money because, you know, it doesn't take a genius to make money when the GDP of the United States is growing at 6%. You borrowed 95% of the money, and you paid 3 or 4 times cash flow. Now you have to put in roughly 50% equity, not 5%. The U.S. economy is growing at 1 or 2%, and you have to buy things at 8 or 9 times cash flow. So it's much harder. You have to roll up your sleeves and do a much better job. That's one of the reasons why the great push of private equity firms is to go now into the emerging markets, at least some firms, because the emerging markets are growing at 10% a year. China has grown at 10% a year for 30 years. In the history of the world, nobody's grown for 30 straight years at 10%. Brazil is growing at 7%. India is growing at 8%. So if you're going to go into an economy that's growing at 10% a year, and you're going to buy things at 7, 8 times cash flow, and you don't need to leverage in many cases, you're going to make a lot more money. So the big shift over the next couple years is the enormous wealth that's going to go from the limited partners and the general partners into the emerging market countries. And the definition of emerging market, for those who haven't followed it, is virtually every country in the world outside the United States and Western Europe. The term was invented in 1981. It was invented by a man who was working at the World Bank, and he went out and was trying to raise a fund that he called the Third World Fund. And people said that's pejorative. And he said, well, I'm going to invest in 20 countries, Taiwan, Thailand, Mexico, and so forth. And they said, well, calling it Third World is pejorative. Come up with a better name. So he said, well, how about the Undeveloped World Fund? And they said, well, that's even worse. So over the weekend, he came up with an inspiration. That's a great idea. And the idea, he says, I'll call it an Emerging Market Fund. Well, everybody wants to be emerging, right? Well, it was only supposed to apply to 20 countries, but in the end, everybody wanted to be called emerging, so they all called themselves emerging. So now every country in the world is an emerging country except Western Europe, Canada, United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So the emerging market is pretty big, but if you focus on the really serious emerging markets, India, China, Brazil, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Colombia, Peru, and so forth, you're going to see growth rates that are 5 to 10% per annum. And if you're investing in those markets, you're going to do much better than the lower growth rates you're going to see in the United States, I believe.
John, you're...
Well, first of all, let me go back to say why did those buyouts, those 17 not fail? On December 16th, the Fed dropped its target rate to the discount rate to 25 basis points, and it was held at December 16, 2008. So the private equity people were able to all of a sudden refinance all of their debt, even maturities that were only 3 and 4 years out. And in 2009, the high-yield market, we call it the junk bond market, had its highest new issuance year ever, to $180 billion. This year, to date, $275 billion. That's all really inured to the benefit of deals like the deals that existed, and to a certain extent, but a lesser extent, new deals. And the cost has even come down further from the debt they incurred in 2006, 2007. So not only have all these transactions guaranteed that they're going to be able to last till they realize whatever return they're going to realize, they've also lowered their cost of financing. So the returns, I think, are going to be a lot better than people thought. And when you don't have losses, when you don't lose, we don't have one troubled portfolio company now in the worst economic time ever. We've had troubled portfolio companies for 35 years that I've been in this business. When you don't have losses, your gains are significantly enhanced. And don't forget the premise. It's relative to what the stock market would earn.
That's the index. Now, to put it in context, the people, you can't remember what the debt was like, the debt market you've talked about was like, but let me try to give you an example. Let's suppose John or I were going to buy a company 3 years ago. And let's suppose I was going to buy this company, or we were going to buy this company for $1 billion. And at that time, you put in roughly 35% equity. So we put in $350 million of equity. We're going to borrow $650 million. So what I would do is I'd call up Mr. J.P. Morgan here and say, I want to borrow $650 million, and would you lend me that? Senior debt, which is secured by the company, and some junk bonds or high yield that's not secured but better than the equity. You would say, I will lend you all $650 million. I say, that's great. And what are the terms? Well, you'll charge you a 1% fee, and the interest rate will be 200 points over LIBOR. Not a bad rate. Okay. Then you would say, but what I'm going to do for you, I'm going to have a loan that's going to be called covenant light, as you called it before, covenant light, which means that you don't have to worry when you own this company that your cash flow isn't doing well, your debt ratios are out of line by normal standards. Don't worry about that. That's just messy stuff the old people worried about a long time ago. We won't have any covenants. So I like that, and I'm going to say, don't go away. I'm going to borrow that money from you, but just to make sure, I'm going to go to Miss Citicorp. And Miss Citicorp, can you match that $650 million loan? And you say, not only can I match it, I'll do something better. I'll give you what's called a PIK toggle feature, which means that if it's inconvenient to pay the interest each quarter, you don't have to worry about it. So, you just pay it in kind down the road. And so if it's inconvenient, you just don't pay it. Well, don't go away, Miss Citicorp. I'm going back to Mr. J.P. Morgan. I say, I know you can't match that. I'm sorry, I like you, but no, I have a better feature. I will not only match that, but what I will do is I will give you a no material adverse condition. What does that mean? That means if a nuclear bomb goes off in the corporate headquarters you're about to buy, we'll still fund the loan. We don't care. There's no condition which can happen that will mean we won't close the deal. So I say, well, geez, that's great. Don't go away, Mr. J.P. Morgan. I'm going to tell goodbye to Miss Citicorp. So I go back to Miss Citicorp and say, I know you can't match, you can't do PIK toggle, you can't do a material adverse condition, and you certainly can't do the covenant light feature and all that. She said, I'll do something better. You know that $350 million of equity you were going to put in? I'll give you that too. You don't have to put any money in either. I'll lend you this $350. We'll call it a bridge equity. So I can go buy this company with no equity. I don't have to worry about atomic bombs going off. I don't have to worry about paying interest. It's a great deal. It was a great time. Those times are not around anymore. But that's what it was like in those days.
It really was. And the fear is, do they come back? Does everybody going to remember? Because I've been in this business 35 years. I never in my life had such fear as I did for several months at the end of from December to early March. I remember the day that the S&P hit 666. I was convinced it was going to 333. I was sure every company in our portfolio would not make it, every one. And we have companies like Yankee Candle, Univision, CDW, Nuveen, Ruth's Chris. I was absolutely convinced. Now, I'm afraid that I'm convinced that they're all fine.
Yeah. Well, what about on the fine point? So you mentioned, John, that we now have interest rates low because of the Fed's decision to keep it at 25 basis points. And why isn't that continuing to inflate the bubble for these deals? You mentioned that that's been something of, that's not your words, but something of the lifeline that's kept the some of the deals going.
At the worst,
to the finish line.
At the worst, you'll probably agree with this. At the worst stage of what was happening, which you accurately described, that's exactly what was happening. The yield for the high yield spread. So high yield securities were, the highest risk rated bonds, a third of which were CCC, most of which never paid off before make their first interest payment. The spread over treasuries, 10-year treasuries, was 263 basis points. So that was what we called the risk premium. So a crappy CCC bond and a company that's over-levered was only getting 263 basis points higher than the 10-year treasury. That spread right now is 630 basis points. The average is 655. But the trend is coming down. That hit 19 on December 16th, the same day the Fed made its decision. That hit 19,950 basis points. So the question is, right now, I don't think we're at bubble. Right. But the trend lines, leverage, purchase price, and spread are heading in a direction that could be dangerous. I don't know what your view.
Well, I got in trouble making a speech at Harvard Business School talking about bubbles, and some of you may have read about this, and unfortunately it got on my Wikipedia site, and you can't get it off. And I made a speech recently in front of the man who invented Wikipedia, and he said, it's too bad, you can't get it off, because anything bad, they never let it off. I was speaking in front of some students, and I thought that, you can always make a sex joke, because it always get a laugh. Students, and I remember the famous chancellor of the University of California system, Clark Kerr, who famously said, when asked how did he build a great university, he said, I always remember three things. Make sure you have good football for the alumni, good parking for the faculty, and good sex for the students. So I thought, okay, I'll have a sex joke. And so I said, let me describe a bubble to you. A bubble is when you don't really, you shouldn't be doing something. You kind of invest, you're afraid your neighbor's going to do something, and you don't want to hear that he made a lot of money or she made a lot of money, so you're going to invest in this, and so you're tempted to do something, and you probably shouldn't. I said, maybe it's sometimes like sex, sometimes maybe you shouldn't do something, but you do it. So I thought it was a joke, it got a little laugh. Well, I'm leaving, and a half hour later, I get a Google alert on my BlackBerry. Rubenstein says private equity equals sex. Now, I didn't actually say that, but I didn't want to go back to the reporter and say, you didn't get this nuance that I had, because it's a second-day story. So now, unfortunately, every time I get interviewed, they have this question. But the truth is, bubbles are going to be around forever. You're never going to really know when you're bubbles. You can't completely determine whether you're in or you're out of a bubble. I think it's very difficult to say. But in terms of the question of why we don't have bigger inflation now, we're running massive deficits. We have debt, as I said, is $13.5 trillion. We have 41% of our budget is in debt. Why don't we have massive inflation? When I worked in the White House, I managed to get inflation to 19%. Very difficult to do that. How come we don't have 19% inflation? Well, there's really two reasons. Two geopolitical things have happened. Number one, in 1979, Deng Xiaoping said, we're going to change. We're going to change the economy of this country. And China basically became more or less a capitalist country. Not completely. It's a different type of capitalism we have in this country. But China has opened up, and now it's the most dynamic economy in the world. It'll be the biggest economy in the world by 2035, and produced enormous amount of low-cost labor that fueled lots of things in the United States. We can buy things at lower prices, but it produced enormous amounts of additions to the labor force. Secondly, In 1989, the Soviet Union fell, and with it, basically, communism around the world fell. That produced another wave of low-cost workers. So you have now a global economy where low-cost goods are coming into the United States, and we can therefore not worry as much about inflation as we would have normally. If we didn't have those factors, we would have workers in this country producing products at much higher cost for fueling inflation. So we don't have that problem right now. At some point, we will have inflation, but right now, inflation for the last 20 years has been more or less about 2%, 2.2% a year. It's now running around that. We actually want inflation because the more pernicious problem is deflation. We know how to solve inflation. You just ratchet up interest rates, you'll solve inflation. We don't know how to solve deflation. It's a much more difficult problem. The Japanese have been struggling with it for a decade, and Ben Bernanke is much more worried that we could go into deflationary environment, which is much more difficult for economy to get its way out of because we don't really know how to do it. So that's why the government isn't that worried about inflation, and I'm not that worried about it right now either because 2%, 3% inflation is not going to solve not going to hurt us all that much. So I think we have relatively low inflation because we're in a global economy and we can afford to do quantitative easing and have low interest rates for a while. It's not going to produce undue inflation.
I want to talk a little bit about your investors and whether their expectations have changed over the last couple of years. I mean, you know, all investors are obviously chasing returns today. Have they lowered their expectations? Are they easy to work with? Are they harder to find? John?
They're harder to find, that's for sure. But I think I'm the head. I also chair the Northwestern University Investment Committee, so I see it from the other side, and that's a $6 billion endowment, probably about the same size as Duke's, in that range. I don't know. Duke's pretty close. And all of the endowments had a near-death experience, too. A lot of them, not Northwestern, but a lot of them experienced significant liquidity, were worried about how they were going to make their capital calls, had no intent at all of that.
The universities went out and borrowed money.
Yeah.
That's what they
had no intent not to make them. And I think expected the worst of private equity. We're unhappy about what I referred to before, and that was the concentration of investment on a time basis. But I think the general mood is there's been such a significant recovery in value on the private equity, many of whom wrote their portfolios down pretty severely and probably more than the accountants would have required them. That's really rebounded. And I think that the investors now are coming out of shock and are in a stage of relief now. You deal with them more than I do.
Here's the situation. The private equity world is coming back, as we said, and it's a great business to be in. And when you can get 20% of the profits on somebody else's money, that's a good thing. It's better than being a lawyer working on an hourly rate basis, though it's not as intellectually challenging, I'm sure.
What about the sex part?
I'd say better for private equity people than lawyers, but I don't know. I'd say that the game is changing in this sense. The general partners don't have the leverage that they did in the old days. In the old days, I would go to people and say, I have a 25% internal rate of return. You want to come into my fund? Here are the terms. You don't like it? I don't need you. I got plenty of investors out there. Today, I can't do that. I got to go on my knees and begging for money because investors have the leverage. I don't have 25% rates of return anymore. I've got lower rates of return. So today, the investors are coming and say, we'll come into your fund, but we want better terms, lower fees. We want other kinds of things that are more attractive. And the principal change that is really occurring in the entire fundraising world is one that Dr. Gao knows quite well, is this. The biggest source of money for people like John and me over the years has been the public pension funds. They're about 25% of the capital for private equity firms. And the reason for that is, that, as I said, they need the higher rate of return because they're underfunded. But what's happened is the sovereign wealth funds around the world, they have become the biggest player because they have much more money than U.S. public pension funds. The U.S. public pension funds are more or less over-allocated. If you had a 10% allocation of private equity in your CalPERS and you had $260 billion, that 260 is now down to 210. Well, if you had 10% of 260, that's 26 billion in the private equity. Now, if you have 210 billion, you're over-allocated. So you can't put much money in the private equity anymore. The sovereign wealth funds did not have as much money invested in private equity. In addition, they don't pay money out. Sovereign wealth funds accumulate capital. They don't have pensioners, so they just accumulate capital. So they're accumulating at enormous rates. And as a result, the biggest source of capital now are the sovereign wealth funds. So when you go to a sovereign wealth fund, they know they have the leverage. They've changed the game this way. In the old days, I would go to an investor and say, give me money, and CalPERS would say, all right, here's $1 billion, $1 billion, and I want these terms, and you get reasonable terms. Then a $5 million investor would get exactly the same terms. And that was the way the industry worked. Now the big sovereign wealth funds say, look, I'm going to give you $1 billion, maybe, but I want it to be managed separately, not in your fund. Or if it's in your fund, I want much, much better terms than the $5 million investor. I don't care if the investor knows, you can tell them, but I want better terms. And we don't have the leverage to say no. So right now, it's so hard to raise money that we are out there, begging for money in different terms. In the private equity world, at the peak, between 2003 and 2007, every single quarter, we gave back to investors at least $14.5 billion. And we peaked at giving $18 billion back. These are profits and distributions. When the bubble burst, we were giving back $2 billion a quarter. And as a result of that, we didn't have the ability to go to investors and say, we're doing such a wonderful job for you, give us more money. So we didn't have the leverage, and now we're still suffering from that. While that $2 billion number is now up to about $10 billion a quarter, it's still harder to get money from investors. And so the sovereign wealth funds have the leverage, and they are basically deciding what the terms are, and they will until our private equity returns get to be much better than they have been the last couple of years.
But what do you think about the shakeout? This industry was overfunded for a period of time.
Well, in the hedge fund world, about a third of the hedge funds went out of business. And why did they go out of business? Well, because hedge fund investors can pull their money out typically every quarter, and even though some of them put up constraints called gates to keep you from doing that, basically hedge fund investors can pull their money out, certainly on a yearly basis, let's say. In private equity, when you go into a private equity fund, you are in for about 10 years. You're committed to 10 years, 5 years to give people like us to invest, and 5 years to harvest these investments, and sometimes another 2 years on top of that. So it's very difficult to get out of these things relative to what hedge funds are. And so while a lot of people haven't been doing that well, relatively speaking, the investors can't quite get out so readily. They can sell their interest to a secondary group, but they can't get out quite as readily. So you won't know whether, for a couple years, whether people can go out and raise a subsequent fund. In other words, let's suppose I haven't been doing well, now investors haven't been able to go away, it's 3 years from now before I have to go out and raise a fund. Well, 3 years from now, I might look better, the world might be different. So some funds are not going to have good track records, and today, if they had to go raise money, they couldn't do it. If they went to their investors and said, today, you can get out of my fund today, or you can stay in, 80% of them would lose their investors. But fortunately, from the private equity funds, they don't have to face that. So it's difficult to know. I'd say there's one major fund in Europe, Candover, that's out of business, and a couple others will probably not see another day. But generally, there's fewer of these people who have gone out of business than you probably would have expected, given the normal kind of shakeout you have when a recession occurs.
So is the pressure from your investors, and particularly from the sovereign fund, does that have an impact upon the compensation structure for the managers of your portfolio?
Absolutely not. No. Well, for the people at the firm, or people in our companies?
For the companies who are managing your portfolio companies, yeah.
Well, basically the way it works, when you buy a company, you hope that the manager you inherit is pretty good. And I'd say, I don't know what your experience is, but generally, some people would say the two biggest mistakes you make in private equity are overpaying at the beginning, which is very difficult to overcome, you can, and keeping the wrong manager. And when you keep the wrong manager, it's not going to get better. If the manager isn't good after 1 year, he doesn't usually get better after 2 or 3 years. So some people would say that the best thing to do is to change managers as quickly as you can when you know the manager isn't good enough. We probably have changed about a third of our managers. We probably should have changed 50% of our managers, and I'd say that's probably normal for the industry. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of the CEOs are changed. But when you recruit a CEO at the beginning or later when you replace them, you tend to give them compensation with their management team that will be about 10 to 15% of the equity. And the reason this is a very good deal for them is many of these managers were making modest sums. They were line manager at GE or some other company. They didn't own equity very much, and they didn't have any chance of getting wealthy. Today, you have a chance, if you're a manager in one of these buyouts, to make a lot of money. We recruited a vice chairman of GE to join one of our firms called Nielsen, makes television ratings, and if he meets his numbers, the company's on a road show. I guess I can't talk about it, so I better not say it. I'll get in trouble. But it's on a road show. I'll go to jail if I talk about it. But let me give another example. If a manager can meet his numbers, he or she could make anywhere from $25 to $150 million if they're really good. And therefore, they have a great incentive, and you don't change that incentive structure that much because the economy is going down. If the economy goes down, you might give them a bigger incentive. If the compensation structure that will probably go down is in people like in our firms, the fee compression is such that we're not going to get the fees that we used to get, and probably we won't earn as much carry because the deals won't be quite as profitable. So I think private equity won't be quite as profitable with the people working at it as it has been. But again, probably better than law, but not as profitable as it has been.
John?
Yeah, it doesn't affect, I agree with that, it doesn't affect
Yeah.
portfolio company management, and I agree, it's, you know, the one thing about the shakeout, and I know it's long-term, I mean, this is private equity firms are the original Walking Dead, they can let, the cadaver doesn't turn bright for a long time, because the trail of fees. But what'll probably happen is you'll have a bunch of people that can't raise another fund. Then you'll have a whole group that are, when you talk about compensation, 1.5% or whatever, that'll try and price cut. And then you'll have the top tier firms that won't have to price cut. And it's just like any other industry.
It's almost unlike every other industry historically. There has been no price discrimination. In most industries, the better players, if I said to you, would you like to buy a Sony television? Here's the Sony television. It's going to cost $2,000. Now, at the same Sony television, it's now called Rubenstein television. I just put my name on it. It's exactly the same product. Nobody will pay the same price. But you have premium pricing in almost everything in the world except in private equity. Everybody charges roughly the same fees, the same carries. That will probably change. There'll be a differentiation. Some people say, if I can go into your fund, if I can go into Madison Dearborn, I'm going to willing to pay a higher fee than to go into Joe Blow's fund because Joe Blow isn't as good. That will probably change. Another thing that will probably change is the way the global private equity world is shaped. Right now, as I said earlier, we are 22% of the GDP in the world, 22%, but we're 100% of the global private equity firms. That probably can't continue. At some point, the people in China will say, wait a second, let me see if I understand this. Carlyle, you're investing in China, yes. We're giving you money from the Sovereign Wealth Fund to do so, yes. You employ Chinese natives to do so. What do we need you, Carlyle, to be investing in our country with our people, with our money? So maybe we'll set up our own global private equity firm based in China, and we'll have it grow around the rest of the world. So at some point over the next 3 to 5 years, you will see global private equity firms based in Brazil and China and the Middle East. But right now, 100% of the global private equity firms are American. And what you're going to see these global private equity firms doing is probably all go public. They will all basically say we're not private equity firms anymore, we're alternative asset managers. We basically manage hedge funds, hedge fund of funds, private equity funds, a whole variety of things that take advantage of the brand name. Now, other organizations like Madison Dearborn say, look, we don't want to be all things to all people. We're going to focus on a certain number of things, and we're going to do it extremely well. And it's a different philosophy, and both work, but you'll see different approaches. But for a long time, America will still dominate private equity. Either global private equity firms or the best private equity firms will probably still be in America. You probably agree with that?
Yes, I do.
So what's going to be the profile of the private equity firms that won't survive, with shakeout, that is going to, when the cadavers will finally fall down?
Unfortunately for them, they can't be like a Carlyle or a Blackstone that has all of a sudden platform and other products now.
Yeah.
They don't have them. They're not big enough, the ones that are not going to fail. So they're a one-product operation, most of them. And they're not, this isn't an industry where you go and acquire a company that's, and fix it. These aren't fixable. So they're gonna disappear. Right. They're gonna fade away. They're really not suited for any other work. They're private equity guys.
And they can go into government, I guess.
I guess I could go back and be a lawyer, but I wasn't very good when I was one, so.
But is this going to be the lack of business success for them? They're not going to be able to generate the returns?
The industry was overfunded.
Yeah.
I mean, when you take a talk, that was the real bubble. Historic funding of private equity, all of a sudden it balloons to $1 trillion. It wasn't just the Carlyles and Blackstones that got funded. It was a lot of guys that set up shop, that were in investment banking, that never done it before. Some of them succeeded, but many didn't. Right. And many of them they got the double whammy of investing during the bubble. So I really think my number is not way off.
I hope you're right, because the less competition, I'd be happier. But
Yeah.
The competition we face now is not just from other private equity firms, but it's there's some disintermediation going on. A lot of the sovereign wealth funds say, hey, I've met Rubenstein, he's not that smart, I can do the same thing he does. So a lot of the sovereign wealth funds are saying, we'll just hire some people, the same people that Carlyle would have hired, and we'll give them some profit incentives, and we don't have to go out and raise money, we have the money. So increasingly you're going to see, like the Canadian Pension Plan and others, and they're here. Here they are.
Yeah, we did it. We
got
slept
it.
long enough.
All right. So we've said everything we know, so now it's up to you.
So So Tony and Xiqing, what do you think of that? Well, welcome.
You mean the U.S. transportation system?
Right. We started off the program with the questions about and what each of you have learned. So John and David have talked about from the financial crisis, and would like to ask Tony that, and then I'd like to ask Xiqing that. So welcome. Also, what do you think about flying out of New York?
Well, I can say this, that the infrastructure in America is way behind that in China. Way behind. Gee, well, it's a little hard to answer that because I don't know what my illustrious colleagues here have said. But some of the lessons that I think we learn is that, we're never as smart in good times as we think we are. And those are really dangerous because you start to think you have the answers and you start to get cocky, and that's when investors make most of the mistakes. Anything bad that's happened before can happen again. I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned. We learned, I think, a little bit that leverage doesn't create value, but it does create risk, and it's a magnifier. But too often we were thinking of, gee, we don't like this deal with a little bit of leverage, but we like it with a lot of leverage. Now we kind of question that sort of premise. You really have to get fundamental value. We've learned that it's very hard to stay disciplined when everyone around you is not very disciplined. And I think that was in some ways the hardest lesson we learned, because we actually concluded in late 2006 that the world was at a peak and we should pull back. And we knew it would be hard to stick to that because we know ourselves and we know our weaknesses. So we actually, in early 2007, in writing to our LPs, we declared that this was a peak, we were pulling back, and there'd be a recession in 2008 and 2009. But, 4 months later, many of our friends and colleagues in other firms were doing the biggest deals in history, and they were all kinds of, I think, the golden age of buyouts and things like that. And we started getting dragged along into the fray. It's very hard to stay disciplined, and it's almost a form of arrogance to think that you have a better view of the future than anyone else. No one can know the future. So we found our discipline crumbling a little bit, and I think we were restrained, but we weren't near as restrained as we should have been. So those are some of the lessons that jumped to mind for me.
Xiqing?
Well, I would almost want to take it outside of the context of what we call the financial crisis, because from my point of view, from where I live and work, China, this financial crisis has taken China all of a sudden into a very different world. Because over the years, we know the Chinese work very hard. We know the Chinese try to do this and try to do that. But for most of the relevant days, the times, we always believe that we're a poor country. And I still remember when I was here many years ago studying. Once we talked about Chinese economy, and our per capita GDP was $150 at the time when the United States was about 25,000. So by the time I went back to China in 1988. We're still about hardly 200 something. We're not hardly 300 yet. That was only 22 years ago. So all of a sudden, China, not only our per capita GDP compared to this country is still very low, but this year they are approaching to 4,000 or something. But the thing is, overall, the aggregate size of the economy has reached to a point where everyone starts to look at it and say, okay, this is something that's very different because this is no longer a poor country. Individually it may be a poor country, but hey, which country in the world where you don't find a individual poor person? But as a country, all of a sudden, not only, it's almost from outside, and the foreigners are telling us, Americans say, oh, this is a major economy now. Now we have to deal with it in a different way. And many Chinese now turn around and said, okay, now, all of a sudden, almost overnight, it's almost too short a time for us to believe that, okay, China now all of a sudden becomes a powerful country with so much power to wield. So that's why you read from the bloggers, from all these sort of nationalistic new hypes that, okay, now we can say no to these people. That's why, when we find all these diplomatic problems with the Japanese, with the Koreans, with Vietnamese, the Filipinos, and everyone.
Americans.
I didn't want to say that. And the government still, if you look at how the government deals with it, at least from outside, you see the government seems to be still doing the age-old thing of Chinese diplomacy. But the problem is that our media has become so much emboldened and so much more democratic that it's true. I very often joke with my American friends that, look, we have a much freer media than yours. And it's true in many ways. The Chinese media is just not controlled at all. It's not balanced, not checked at all. They just come out and say anything. So, everything gets reported on these things. And we got, it becomes almost a phenomenon that I wouldn't want to use the word, but just bear with me because I'm away from this country, so don't hold me for PC. I want to use the word elite. The traditional Chinese elite, you call it class or academics or whatever, people now start to be at loss what to say. So they all shut up. And especially in the past few years, all the I would call the mainstream economists, the best theorists and the best reformers, they all shut up. They say, well, what do we say? Whatever we say, you got a whole lot of people coming from whatever corner of China on the blogger and attacking you. So people start to shut up, and then you know what happens with that. That's a mob mentality. So this to me is the unintended consequences of the crisis.
Now, Tony, one of the things we talked about with David and John is how the crisis has changed the business during the last 2 years, and perhaps even changed it going forward. Is that true with how has your business model changed, or has it changed, or how's it had to be adapted during the last 2 years, and what are you looking at moving forward?
Well, I'm with two of the smartest deans of the industry, so I'm sure that you've learned a lot more from them than I could contribute. But I'd say a few things. First of all, I think the industry will be smaller, and I think it'll be smaller in terms of number of firms, but smaller in terms of each of our ability to raise capital. And I think we're going to learn a hard lesson, which is that there was a little bit of an attitude before that capital was infinite. As soon as we put that fund to work, we'd go raise another fund, and any deal that got over a return bar was okay to do it. We're finding now that we can put more money out than we can raise, faster than we can raise it. And you can only, in our business, you can only invest the money you have, obviously. So the constraint is, what return where do we have to set the return bar that scales the outflow to equal the inflow, and it's way higher. So I think you'll see higher returns in a smaller industry. I think you'll see a much more operational industry. Before, when we raised our last fund, we had 9 operating people. We have 56 today. In 5 years, you'll see a much more global industry because 50% of what we're doing now is in Asia, and it was almost nothing 5 years ago. So that means, frankly, a much bigger organization for a smaller capital pool. So the economics of the business are much worse as well.
Xiqing, when we did this program in December of 2008, we were just at the early stages. We didn't know it then. We knew we were in the early stages of the crisis. So how's the investments in your fund changed over the last 2 years in terms of allocations, what you're looking at?
Well, one major change, if there is change, because, one thing has never changed, that's, as a sovereign wealth fund, we're almost destined from day one that we're going to be a bureaucracy, we're going to be very, very cumbersome, and we're going to be constrained by many of government interferences and stuff, and things like that. We tried very hard to stay away from that. Not totally successful, but to some extent. Because of successfulness of what we did, we have antagonized a lot of government agencies. But if you look at the portfolio, we have changed tremendously in one way. In that, when we started, we thought we were going to be since we're a financial investor, we thought we were going to be mostly doing public securities, very conservative, not, taking too much risk. Therefore, when this company had only two people, our chairman, Mr. Low, and myself, we talked together every day for many days, and I said, look, I suspect that for the first 3 to 5 years, we're not going to be in direct investment or anything for too much at all. Let's put over 90% of the money in all public securities, and mostly managed by outside managers. That has changed tremendously. We still use a lot of outside managers, including many people here. But at the same time, we have been trying very hard to build our own team. That's a natural process for, with or without the financial crisis. But one thing has changed tremendously is the amount of money you put in public securities and private or direct investment. Because with the crisis, all of a sudden we realized that originally we thought we were humble enough to think, oh, we have nothing, except for the little bit of money we had. We had no expertise, no experience, not even a very good system to work with, no discipline. So we never thought we would just try to do it ourselves. But then we realized that the amount of money we had was very, very important for a lot of reasons, not just for money itself, but really it's at a time when this money can muster not only the amount of profit tantamount to its, the regular expectation of the return of the amount of money, but really it can give you a lot of power for other things, to demand for almost more in many different ways. Especially in the investment field, when size, originally we thought was, it matters, but it didn't matter as much as what we realized later. And we found many opportunities brought to us where, if you're smaller than $1 billion or $2 billion contribution to the thing, don't talk about it. They don't even want to talk to you. But if you have that, and then you get to some cases where, you're just offered, the percentage of return you're offered is, you can never see it in other places. So that's a time when we start to think, okay, we need to do it in a different way. We can't, and at first when we used managers, we thought, well, since we don't have anything, we have to totally depend on the managers for their thing. Gradually, as today, we realize that many times, many potential investee companies would not want PEs in, would not want the real professionals in, simply because who we are, they say nice things, but I said, well, basically it's because we are the dumb money. They want the dumb money in because, these people will not interfere with their things. They don't want those smart people in, negotiate them to the last penny. And because of that, we thought, well, we at first, for the first year, it was no, we absolutely have to bring someone else in. They had to do it. But today, gradually, with our team building up, now we have about 500 people. This is very typical trend of bureaucracy. But these people now, most of these front office people have been trained in Western institutions. And they said, well, if we can do it, we do it. So that is another change of paradigm. And the one more thing is that when we started, because of the fact that we put most money in public market, in public securities, as of today, emerging markets still account for only about less than 15%. And 85% is the developed market. But if you look at GDP contribution, then emerging market accounts for about 48, 49% growing. Now, so when you, of course, this 48% is not the same as 40% on this side because of all, say, legal system, transparency, political stability, corruption, all these things. But it's changing very fast. Therefore, we are greatly increasing this part.
Just a final question here to each one of you, and that is, if you could have one wish granted by the administration and the Congress who could come together and grant your wish, what would it be, John?
Extension of all of the tax cuts for 2 years and then total gridlock.
David?
Actually, I would like to have the administration and the Republicans and the Democrats in Congress be locked in a room for, 2 or 3 days. They can't get out until they come up with a budget solution that's going to get the United States on a course towards eventually balancing the budget. And they are not allowed out unless there's a solution that will pass the Congress, because unless they're forced to do something, nothing's going to happen. And so I would lock them in a room and throw away the key till they come up with a solution.
Tony?
Well, I'm sort of like David, but I'd take it broader. I'd like the government and the politicians to put aside their parochial constituencies and worry about how do we make America strong enough to compete on a global basis with China and other countries 10 and 20 years from now. We've got to deal with immigration and education and infrastructure and, yes, the budget deficit and many things, but we have to be thinking the way China does about our long-term strategy as a country to make us globally effective.
And what can we do for the people of China?
Well, we don't expect you to do something for people of China, but you can definitely do something for people of the world by passing a law which says the United States government is not going to print its money just for its own people. You are printing money for the whole world, so be responsible for that.
Okay, thank you. And thank our panelists here.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.